I have been looking forward to this for months, and I know the ACS team has as well, so thank you so much for having us. James shared a little bit about my background, but I thought I'd share something a little more personal, which is that I often find it very ironic that I ended up working at the American Cancer Society. So I grew up in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, which I don't know if you know it, but I think it's kind of like the unofficial cigarette capital of the country. And so when I was in elementary school, they used to take us on field trips to the cigarette factory. And we would go and we would marvel at the, big machines making them. And I can still remember all those cigarettes stacked up, waiting to be put into packages. Now, what a truly horrible field trip to take children on. Can you imagine if someone tried to do that today? But over time, I've kind of come to think that that experience really helped prepare me for my calling, because I believe my calling is to bring people together who all want to end cancer as we know it for everyone. So welcome. By coming here tonight, you've signed up to do that. I don't know if you did it or not, but Team Fighting Cancer is one we cannot have enough people on. There's no tryouts, and you're all on it now, so thank you so much. So in preparing for this, as James and I talked about this session, we really leaned into the fact that, cancer research is a fairly straightforward prospect to understand, but the ecosystem of getting treatments to patients is not. It's very complex. Research happens in so many places around the country and around the globe. Huge companies work on drug development alongside scrappy startups that are led by former researchers. And some people have to spend their entire life savings to fight cancer, which is not fair. So what can we do? How do communities come together to help? And how are all the people and institutions collaborating to move this critical work forward? It's a very big question, but it's one we're going to try and answer for you today. So fortunately, I have brought some very smart coworkers with me. Of the three of us, two of us are doctors, and I'll go ahead and let you guess which one is not. So first, let me introduce you to Dr. Bill Dahut, the Chief Scientific Officer for the American Cancer Society. So before joining ACS, Dr. Dahut held leading roles at the National Cancer Institute, where he served as Scientific Director for Clinical Research at the NCI Center for Cancer Research, head of the agency's Prostate Cancer Clinical Research Section, and NCI Clinical Director. He received his MD from Georgetown University and completed clinical training in internal medicine at the National Naval Medical Center, followed by training in hematology and medical oncology at the Bethesda Naval Hospital and Medicine Branch of NCI. And then beside him, we have Dr. Steve Curtis. So Dr. Curtis is the Interim Managing Director of BrightEdge and the Vice President of Innovation and Impact Investing for the American Cancer Society. Prior to joining ACS, he managed MPM Capital's Oncology Innovations Fund, a hybrid venture philanthropy investment collaboration with Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. And he also has experience with Eli Lilly and Company, Bioscience Ventures Group within 2M Companies, and Reata Pharmaceuticals. Dr. Curtis holds a Bachelor's of Business and Biology from Cornell, and then for a little fun, a PhD in cancer genetics from Harvard Medical School. Yes. So before I turn it over to them, I want to talk to you a little bit about the American Cancer Society and who we are. I find that the American Cancer Society is an organization that a lot of people know of, but few people actually really know what the impact that ACS has is. So there's a few reasons why I'm really proud to work for ACS, but chief among those is that ACS is focused on every cancer. Every cancer matters to us, and every person going through cancer matters to us. And I see this as a real advantage for our organization. So just as an example, when you're doing cancer research, oftentimes you don't know what types of cancer that research is ultimately going to end up benefiting. And even more importantly than that, I've noticed that when families are going through cancer, it's rarely just one type of cancer that they're faced with. So ACS is a place where you can come and support everyone you love that's going through cancer, and we can in turn support them. So there are three big areas of impact for ACS. These are huge. I could literally spend hours talking about each of these. I promise I'm not going to do that. But I do want to just give you a little sense of each one so you can have a feel for the organization and what type of impact we're driving. So if you look at this triangle, We're going to be working around to the right, starting in the blue. So first is our discovery work, or more commonly known as research. So you probably already know that ACS is the largest private funder of research in the country. Only the federal government funds more cancer research than us. However, what you might not know is there's actually two types of research that we fund. The first is extramural, which is more commonly known. That is when we provide a grant to a clinician or to a researcher working at an institution. But we also have intramural research. So intramural research is done by staff members of the American Cancer Society, and they are looking at longitudinal studies where they're following people throughout their whole lives. They're looking at their habits, where they live, some elements of biology, and seeing who develops cancer. And this has taught us some really important things. It provided the first link between smoking and cancer, and it's informed a lot of what we know about how to limit your cancer risk through a healthy lifestyle. Next, moving into the red, is advocacy. So the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network is a part of ACS, and it's also its own bipartisan financial organization that works with elected officials in the federal government and in all 50 states. There's a literal army of volunteers who share their stories and support a legislation that'll benefit people going through cancer now and who may have it in the future. There's some things we take for granted that are because of our advocates that we have, so such as mammograms being covered by health insurance, or more recently biomarker testing being covered by health insurance in some states. Our advocates did that. This is also how we secure the largest portion of research dollars through the federal government. And finally, the dark blue box there, patient support. So this area is huge. It's very broad and deep, but it's focused on supporting people through their cancer journey. So this can look like ACS being the #1 trusted source of cancer information, us giving people a ride to treatment or a place to stay during their treatment, being a leader and setting screening recommendations, and really much, much more. So with all this work we do, I think you can see ACS is really positioned uniquely as a convener in the cancer space, and we do that. We facilitate collaboration among researchers, or among healthcare providers, hospitals, and so much more. Now, of course, we're going to be diving into research today and the collaboration around that. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Dahut.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, here we go. First slide. So I am so lucky. I actually get to oversee all of the research we do at the American Cancer Society. And there has never been a better time to study cancer. It's terrible to get cancer. We know that. But the progress that's been made in cancer research over the last 20 or 25 years is extraordinary. I know we have some scientists in the room, we have oncologists in the room, but we think even back what it was like in the 90s, we used very crude tests and how we treated patients, and we used chemotherapy for almost everything. And now we really have ways, and a lot of times, to come up with very precise treatments for patients. So as I think about what we should focus on, we really want to make progress everywhere across the continuum, from patients who haven't been diagnosed yet, we call those normal people, to people that actually have an early cancer, and survivors. And there are a lot more survivors now. And so that's a good thing. There's like 18 million survivors now. And we think in about 15 years, it might be 40 million survivors. And survivors all have their own individual needs, particularly when we have a lot of younger people having a cancer diagnosis. We want to find new ways to treat cancer, mechanisms. And then importantly, we want to spend a lot of time focusing on what is really our secret sauce, the American Cancer Society, is how to prevent cancer, how to screen for it, and how to find it really early on. We have great relationships with the community, with the primary care doctors, and really a way to find cancer before it can make you sick. And it would be wonderful if we had a situation where if someone said, oh, I have cancer, they're like, okay, can I see you? I'll see you Tuesday at the bridge match or something, right? It's not right now. It's still a really scary disease, but we're making progress. And then we need to fund the next generation, not as a jobs program, not because it's something we should just be doing, because that's who's going to have the great ideas. The younger people have all the good ideas. They figured that whole 6-7 thing out, right? And so, but that's really important to us too. So what's been going on over the last year, as you can see, is because of concerns about federal funding, we have had a tremendous increase in the applications for our grants. People are excited to do cancer research. We give grants out twice a year, and you can see just going from the fall of 2023 to summer 2025, we changed our cycles a little bit. We've really doubled the number of people applying for grants. People are hungry to do cancer research. It's such an exciting time. So how can we do this? Because, we don't have endless dollars. Maybe you guys do, but we don't have endless dollars. And so the best way to do this is with partnerships. We're finding ways to collaborate with cancer centers, with individuals, in a way to really drive the research together. Focusing on what we do best individually, but finding things we do better together. So here's an example with a venture capital fund called Yosemite. It's led by Reed Jobs, who is also very interested in cancer research. And now, for this year, the last year, the following year, together we're putting in $6 million on cancer research together. Last year we really focused in 2 areas only. One was an area called vaccines. Now vaccines really to treat cancers. And the second thing is really looking broadly at something we call T-cell engagers. So it's a way really to find part of the immune system really to promote cancer treatment. So working together with a venture capital company to really use our research knowledge, their capital, some of our capital to drive things. And here's an example of a Nobel Prize winner who we funded. We funded her actually when she was a postdoc. She was a chemist. Nobody else would fund a chemist who wanted to do biology. We funded her as a postdoc. We funded her first grants. She basically got up and said if it wasn't for the American Cancer Society, she wouldn't be in science. She did pretty well. She got the Nobel Prize. And now she's developed an antibody drug conjugate. And what that is basically a drug that finds a protein on the outside of a cell and then attaches on the other side, really a way to kill the cell. And this is one for kidney cancer. And we're working with a lot of other organizations that same way, because we got to do this together. Cancer is hard to do. And if the federal government is having challenges, then we need to work together because we're getting closer. I think we're in a lot of ways in the last mile. The last mile is tough. If you're doing a marathon, it's tough. Climbing those hills, a mile is tough. But working together organizations, some organizations here, we're working with nonprofits together, finding what we do best, what they do best, keeping our independence, but working together. And then one thing we're doing, we're trying to really incentivize people to drive ideas from the laboratory to the clinic. We're doing a lot of stuff with Breakthrough, a lot of stuff, sorry about that. A lot of stuff with BrightEdge, who's our venture capital firm, and you'll hear a lot about that. But we're also doing stuff where we're giving small grants to investigators who need to do a few more experiments to just figure out other ideas, a possibility to work. And we're getting great interest. People want their science to translate in the clinic. When I started off in medicine, there's a real separation between the laboratory and the clinic. And now people understand that helping patients is a really way to drive improvement. So what is the state of cancer? Every year in January, we talk about what we call our Cancer Facts and Figures report, and there's a lot of publicity about it. And we had some really good news this year. At this point, 70% of people with a cancer diagnosis are alive 5 years. It's a dramatic change when it was back in the early 60s, it was about 30 or 40%. People are living longer. Now that means it's complicated. It's complicated for side effects, for treatments, maybe taking care of your mom and your kids at the same time, but living longer. That's a win. Living longer, after a diagnosis with better treatments. A lot of this is better treatments. Overall, we've seen a dramatic decrease in our cancer mortality rate. If the rates had continued at the same time, nearly 5 million people more would have died since the early 90s. And we're actually seeing some rates going up in some of the cancers, which we'll talk about a little bit. Overall, still over about 2 million people diagnosed with cancer, way too many still. And sadly, over 600,000 people will die this year from the disease. And that's like 10 football stadiums, way too many. So there's a sense of urgency when we're doing so well in the science, we have to do better. Lung cancer still causes the most deaths, more than number 2 and number 3 on the list combined, still largely driven by tobacco use. But again, we're seeing more and more commonly, you're hearing people who have lung cancer and they're non-smokers. So we need to find ways to treat people who we wouldn't normally think about who had a lung cancer diagnosis. In some parts of the countries, other countries such as Taiwan, in women, non-smoking lung cancer is now the #1 lung cancer cause. So I'm an oncologist, and so what really is important to me, I think, is the striking ability for people who have metastatic cancer to live longer. That's really dramatic change. Myeloma, now 62% of the people are alive at 5 years, liver cancer up multiple times, lung cancer is increased, and look in the distant disease, metastatic disease, we're making real progress. Now about 1/3 of the people who have metastatic cancers are alive at 5 years. You know, this is back in the 90s, it was about 15 or 16%. This is not good enough, but we are making real progress. Now, we are seeing other information that you may have heard about that is concerning, and this is a change. We're seeing a real rise in colorectal cancer in younger adults. And we went back into the 90s, colorectal cancer was the 4th leading cause of cancer death in men and women. Now, overall, if you look at men and women under the age of 50, it's #1. So this is a real rise, and it's a generational change. We're seeing it actually when you start people being born in the 60s and the 70s and beyond. With each generation, we're seeing an increased risk of colorectal cancer. And what we're seeing about this, which is sort of interesting, is that the colorectal cancer is actually anatomically in a different location than in prior generations. So if you went back a few generations, most of colon cancers were actually closer to the small intestine. We call that proximal. But now we're seeing it more and more distal, closer to the rectum, and we're seeing increase in rectal cancer cases now. So rectal cancer cases are up significantly in all populations, but particularly in young adults. And about 45, now about 1/3 now actually of colorectal cancers in young adults are actually rectal cancer. And rectal cancer, because of the location, it often leads to much more complicated surgery and radiation and treatment than colon cancer elsewhere in the body. Again, some statistics, younger patients are more likely to present with cancer at a more advanced disease, even though they'll do much better with treatment stage for stage, because oftentimes they're sort of ignored, to be honest with you. And the symptoms are sort of told, you're too young to have a cancer, you're too young to have it, or you're too young to be screened. People are often present with advanced disease, about a significant number of young people, which is why, sadly, it's now leading the cause of death in people under the age of 50. So again, we're talking about this overall. So the question is, why do we see this change in colon rectal cancer, and why do we see the change anatomically? And I think one thing to think about is we always say, well, it's got to be obesity, right? But if it was obesity only, we wouldn't see it located only in one area. So something is going on, changing probably the body's susceptibility to cancer to that part of the colon and the rectum. And we do know folks that are very heavy drinkers, more than me. No, I have more heavy drinkers, drinking at least 21 drinks a week. They have a much higher risk of rectal cancer. And we think of that because we think that the toxins from alcohol probably accumulate before they're evacuated. And so we think of rectal cancer, there's probably some accumulation of some toxins, whether that's change in the microbiome, that's plastics, processed food. And that's why we're seeing this increase in colorectal cancer, and particularly in more distal cancer. So work needs to be done. It's an area of incredible research. We've lowered our screening age. So if you know anyone who's 45 or older, they should be screened. And anyone who has symptoms of their young adult, particularly rectal bleeding, they need to be seen. And if they go to a doctor who says it's hemorrhoids, go to another doctor. Because the most common presenting symptoms for young adults with colon rectal cancer is actually rectal bleeding. So talk to your kids. Prostate cancer. Now you can talk amongst yourselves. So prostate cancer continues to be the leading cause of cancer amongst men and the second leading cause of cancer death. And we saw a tremendous initial increase in prostate cancer incidence, which is the number of cases, and a significant fall in deaths around the time we started doing more screening. And then we did an experiment in this country. We told men, don't be screened. It's not way worth your time. The risk is bad. And so what we saw was a fall in the number of cases, but we've seen a leveling in the number of mortality rates. And we're seeing, since over the last decade, every year about 5.5% to 7% per year, men who are presenting with prostate cancer at more advanced stages. So men we think who would have been screened and found an earlier stage cancer, where it's by and large, outcomes are tremendous because men were told, don't worry about it. Now they're having to worry about it. And so there has been sort of a readjustment on it. We, for one, are updating our prostate cancer screening guidelines. You'll hear a lot about this summer. But it's a blood test, guys. It's a blood test. There was that commercial from the Super Bowl. It's a blood test. And we know a lot more about prostate cancer that everywhere along the way you can stop and evaluate the next steps. You get the blood test, you may stop there. Maybe you need an MRI. If the MRI doesn't look bad, you can stop there. If you have a biopsy, if it's not an aggressive cancer, you can stop. So it's a blood test. Talk to your doctor about it. We also know there are certain people that are much higher risk. We know if you have a family history, it's actually the cancer that is the most highly aligned with familial risk. And we know some inherited genes put you at higher risk. If you have the BRCA2 gene, BRCA2 gene, the breast cancer gene, you're at a much higher risk for prostate cancer and an advanced prostate cancer. So it's also important to know it varies significantly from different racial groups. Black men are much more likely to be diagnosed, but much higher risk of actually dying from the disease. So we do see some variations among different environments and different racial ethnic minority groups. And so what we are very interested in coming up with ways to screen people based on their risk, actually for all cancers. We want precision-based screening as opposed to screening you turn to a certain age. To know who should be screened more often, who should be screened earlier, and who should be screened maybe even less often based on what you have. And so we brought together a group this year in Sarasota, because that's where I have a condo, to talk about it. And then we also are talking to the NC National Cancer Institute about sort of larger studies to find out ways to determine who should be screened and who should get an MRI after that. I want to talk about ovarian cancer too. Ovarian cancer doesn't come from the ovaries. So ovarian cancer comes from the fallopian tubes, the vast majority of time. So, the ovary people had a good PR person, they got it named after themselves, but ovarian cancer, by and large, almost always comes from the fallopian tubes. You have these little fimbriae, we call them, fingers from the fallopian tubes that go into the ovaries. So what we now know, if a woman has her fallopian tubes removed by the age of 50 or 55, but could be older beyond that, that essentially eliminates the risk of normal ovarian cancer, the common kind. Some of the rarer kinds, there's still a risk. So overall, it reduces your risk of ovarian cancer by 80%. And so this is a major effort of the American Cancer Society to get that word out there. We're going to do research on, because sometimes you have precancer lesions left behind in the fallopian tubes. And so we're studying the risk of that. But we need to educate the professional community. And we need to know people like you guys that this is going on. And so, so certainly if a woman has a cesarean section, she wants permanent contraception, and she was thinking of what to do. If she has her tubes taken out then, as opposed to being tied, dramatically reduce her risk of ovarian cancer. So this is information that needs to be out there. So that you'll start hearing about us from us. It's incredibly important. This is for all women. We're studying also what happens for women at higher risk if you have the BRCA gene and other aspects. You take the tubes out first, the ovaries out later. But you keep the ovaries in for normal folks so you don't have the problems then with hormonal treatment. So it's one of the major areas of our topics. You'll see prostate cancer, obviously colorectal in the young, and you hear us talking a lot about science for ovarian cancer prevention and treatment. And then rural cancer disparities are real. Folks who live in rural areas, maybe not rural here because you got Shaw, but rural areas overall, their outcomes are significantly worse as far as cancer, about 20% worse. And this is a forgotten factor, and it's rural in Ohio and Appalachia, and it's rural in Mississippi, and it's rural in Maine, and it's rural in Utah. And so we are bringing teams together to work on this. Maybe AI will help. Maybe it's a way to get them to a cancer center. Maybe it's a way to get better treatment there. But this is sort of a forgotten problem that we're concerned it's only going to get worse. if we don't actually work on it now, because cancer treatments are going to be precision-based, are going to be more technical, and we need to get treatment for people that are not necessarily around the corner from MD Anderson. So we are actually pulling funding together. We're working with universities, we're working with other nonprofits to try to put these teams together, to work together from different geographic areas to focus on the needs for rural adults. So this is another major area of us is working on rural cancer disparities. We run these large cohort studies, it was mentioned. We follow patients overall for 30 or 40 or 50 years to really before they have a cancer diagnosis and beyond that. And we've made, as mentioned, lots of great discoveries there. So almost all these findings were really led by people enrolling and giving us information and sometimes blood and other aspects, which really led the findings. The biggest findings, of course, is we showed the link between smoking and cancer. It was 3 guys who were smokers who first did the trial, and then they were shocked. They switched to pipes, it was close enough, I guess. But over time, we continue to study this. We have another, large 300,000 folks we're studying now with incredibly important biological information. We're also partnering potentially with other organizations looking at risk of cancer and aging in this. There's an inverse relationship between Alzheimer's disease and cancer. Kind of well studied that people with Alzheimer's disease have a less likely risk of cancer, so we're going to be studying that. And we're talking to our friends at the Heart Association and inflammatory, because there's obviously overlap there too. So how about AI? We have to talk about AI. It's like the law, right? Pretty much. So where's AI going to have its impact first? I think it's going to help us first discover better treatments, because we can basically do laboratory studies with AI much more quickly. It's going to make imaging, pathology, and radiology much more standard and much more detailed. And in theory, rural hospitals then can have their stuff read digitally anywhere and have results. It should improve clinical care and hopefully decrease disparities. So we're doing a lot in prostate cancer. My research in prostate cancer, I'm allowed to have to talk about it. But really, it's come a much better way with clinical decision making. There's now AI-based techniques. If you're getting radiation, they can basically look at your slide and tell you how much hormonal therapy you need as far as that. And it's a digital pathology, it's no glass in anywhere, and are able to basically do that. That's AI driven. They're not even sure of all the markers doing it, but they have enough data on how to do that. Our cancer prevention studies I mentioned basically took lots of data elements and all the folks with breast cancer and have new techniques of really being able to use AI to tell people to find the breast cancer and also determine, basically the risk of the breast cancer. This is the prostate cancer I mentioned. You can use molecular subtypes for kidney cancer using AI. Again, if we just try to do them one at a time by a pathologist, we would never get there. So there's a lot of hidden aspects of AI that, that actually can help predict cancer outcomes. And it's also going to be really important in screening tests. We do cancer screening guidelines. Our guidelines are probably some of the most valuable in the country. And we are going to start adding AI to our guidelines because they make the ability to read images better. We still need radiologists, but this is really an ability using an MRI, in particular with women with dense breasts, to determine which ones have a cancer, and it was much better at picking up cancer than using radiology by itself. And again, lung cancer screening, this is a simple test using AI technology that they can tell which of the lesions are more likely to develop lung cancer, which ones can be followed in a different way. And so this is simple tests. There are other tests out there. Again, early detection, we're great believers in it. But again, we don't want a situation where people are going unneeded tests beyond that. And we find a lot of grants there. Again, ultimately what we do is we work with others outside of ACS to do the vast majority of our work through grants. We have our own scientists who collaborated, our own material, but we depend on scientists and individuals around the country in order to drive our work. And this is some examples of some stuff we do in AI. So I'm going to end on something that you're not going to forget about. So I'm going to talk about colonoscopies. So there's actually a correlation with your physician between the number of polyps or adenoma he or she finds and the cancer risk of the patient. And it kind of makes sense, right? If a doctor goes to us and does a colonoscopy and never finds a polyp, then they're going to miss a cancer. So doctors who find more polyps, more adenomas, that correlates with fewer cancers. So that makes sense, right? Okay. So, and this is some more data. This is not on the test, but basically your risk of having colorectal cancer declined in a population if the physicians found more polyps. Okay, you can buy that, right? And now there's new technology out there that as the physician goes through, actually puts a little square box around where the polyps are. Because some of the polyps, like you see in B, could be really hard to see. And so we think that by itself, this CAD e-alert box, you still have to have a pathologist go take a look at it. And also afterwards with AI, you can go through much more quickly and basically reread the colonoscopies. Nobody looks at things right now. And this is another polyp that we found. But you guys may have noticed that people sometimes get more tired in the afternoon. You guys probably don't. But, and performance maybe not be as great. And so what was found is that if you looked at colonoscopy data later in the afternoon, they found that polyps, adenomas, many fewer are detected. So you know how it is. You got to pick the kid up for soccer. Yeah, colonoscopy looks fine. You probably want to go earlier in the morning when people are alert because you want them to find a polyp if it's there, if you can take it out. Now, if you add the AI technology, it actually corrects for all that. And so that's how we think this stuff is overall going to help. You know, it's not going to get rid of physicians. It's not going to take things away, but it's going to make what we do better and balance off the human nature of it. But it's pretty striking, the ability to sort of basically find polyps using techniques when the data is pretty striking that later in the afternoon, just not as many are found. And I bet they still grow at the same rate. So we have some conferences coming up. We give our big award every year. It'll be to Dr. Tyler Jacks. Tyler is doing some great basic science work, also doing work with ovarian cancer. And we do a cancer with the CRUK, Cancer Research UK, every year on cancer prevention, the science of cancer prevention, because preventing cancer is so much better than having it, and it's so much better to have it earlier. So again, we're getting there, guys. You know, we need your help. We're getting in the last miles. Last mile's hard. A mile up these mountains is really hard. But we're so much better than we were when I was a fellow and beyond that. So thank you. I'm going to turn it over here to Dr. Curtis to tell you how we're going to do the next step. So thanks a lot. Thanks. Thanks.
All right. Good evening, everybody.
A little long maybe, but not too bad.
I'm not going to talk about colonoscopies. But an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you to the organizing committee for having us. It's absolutely wonderful. I had some fabulous conversation before this, this part of the symposium, so really excited to keep going. As Kelly mentioned, I'm Steve Curtis. I have the absolute privilege of leading BrightEdge, which is the Innovation and Impact Investing division within the American Cancer Society. We manage a suite of innovation programs to help move those research discoveries out of the labs and into the companies that are going to develop those into the next products. That could be the diagnostic test, right, that catches the next cancer, the treatment that someone needs when they are diagnosed with cancer. We also manage an impact investing fund that is donor funded so that we have the capital to be a voice in the room when those product development decisions are being made. As you had heard, the sort of tripartite approach of the American Cancer Society with research and advocacy and direct patient support, that ultimate treatment of a patient requires a product. Right? It's a diagnostic test, it's a therapeutic that is injected into someone's arm or a pill that someone needs to take. And those decisions on how those products are made and who they're going to benefit needs the voice of a group like the American Cancer Society in those conversations. So that is why in 2019 we spun up BrightEdge as the ability for the ACS to play an important and active role in those conversations. I've spent probably 20 years trying to perfect my elevator pitch of what I do for a living. I still don't think my parents know what it is. But last year, my youngest daughter was asked in sort of her Father's Day activity, right, write this thing about daddy. She worded it better than I could ever. She said, my daddy helps scientists turn their magic potions into healthy medicines. Like, how did she come up with that? It was brilliant. I mean, she's my daughter, but So that is what we do at BrightEdge. We work with the incredible researchers that are funded both by the ACS and elsewhere. We look for incredible innovation, and we work with other funders that can help turn those innovations into products developed by companies and move them into patients and accelerate the next generation of treatments, diagnostics, et cetera. That process takes a long time. When I was first getting started, the adage was, a new drug takes 10 years and $1 billion. Well, those numbers have at least doubled, right? It's close to 20 years for a new product to come from a great idea into an actual therapy that's approved by the FDA, and the price tag is well over $2 billion now. So it's a lot of capital that needs to go in to help these products move forward. And without intentionality, the innovation that Bill was just talking about, the incredible research that is happening, could outpace that impact, right? Because we want to see that research actually benefit patients. So when we think about BrightEdge's role, we're showing up, as I mentioned, as impact investors, and really the patient centricity is really important to our entire ethos and the investment decisions that we make. So, as was mentioned, ACS has played a critical role in many of the breakthroughs. We have supported the researchers, we've supported the research, right? We have a really distinct advantage in the seat that I have the privilege of sitting in, of having the leverage of the 27,000 grantees that ACS has supported over its heritage, right? The 53 Nobel Prize winners that we saw as young budding scientists before they won a Nobel Prize and saw that their research was something worth supporting. And continuing to support the next generation is so important. So that's the vantage point that I get to sit in every day and utilize with my team to make these investment decisions. So, thinking about access to all these great discoveries, the world-leading key opinion leaders that we have access to, the data and expertise, Bill talked about cancer facts and figures, some of these areas that, as an organization, we are putting resources behind in all of the ways, right? Showing up as an investor, investing alongside others to show the way of where the most impact is going to be had, and not just following the herd and investing in the next Me Too type therapy, but something that's going to have transformational impact for patients is exactly what we're seeking to do. But I'm going to take a bit of a step back. So in the broader ecosystem, everyone might not know this, but obviously Big Pharma plays an incredible role in supporting research in that translational step, that taking a breakthrough discovery and turning it into a product. But more than 50% of the drugs that are eventually brought to market actually have their beginnings in a small, scrappy startup company. They don't originate within the walls of Big Pharma. Big Pharma might ultimately acquire that company to move that product forward and bring it through the later stage, larger clinical trials and use its commercial workforce to make sure that it gets to patients. But most of those products that are ultimately developed, and that's for cancer and basically all indications, more than 50% originate in startup companies. So that part of the ecosystem is incredibly important. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time now kind of taking that step back and talking about what is happening in that funding environment, right? What decisions are being made that will ultimately impact the pipeline of new therapies that are approved by the FDA and can reach patients. So I'm a data geek. I love great, well-written reports. Our friends at HSBC, Innovation Banking, as well as Silicon Valley Bank do a phenomenal job talking about the state of our industry, and these are just two reports that I adopted some data from for the next couple of slides. But before I get there, some timely news. So we talked about the role that ACS obviously plays. The NCI and the National Cancer Institute, and then more broadly the NIH are the largest funders, right, of research. They also have a division that focuses on small businesses. So the SBIR and STTR programs are known as America's Seed Fund. These are federally mandated allocations of the budget of NIH to support small businesses. SBIR stands for Small Business Innovation Research Program. STTR is Science Translation and Technology Transfer Research. This program was at risk of going away not that long ago. Just last week, the Senate reauthorized the bill to keep the SBIR, STTR programs alive, and we could not be happier that that's true. Many of the companies that we support and fund, many of the academic medical centers that spin out companies rely on these fundings to help get those companies out the door and get their early start. So we're really glad to see this. There's a little nuance in sort of what was funded, or what was reauthorized and what that actually means. But the top line is that program is alive and well, and we're really happy about it. So, so taking the step back. So who is funding the majority of those early stage biotech companies? Well, it's your venture capital industry. And taking a look at the healthcare venture capital industry, there's actually some concerning numbers of late. So during the pandemic years, 2020, 2021, our industry reached an all-time peak. Some would say it was a bubble, some would say it was a little over exuberant. It probably was all of those things. There's a lot of generalist investors putting money into healthcare. But we are far off of some of those peak numbers. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit and what the implications of that are. So the graph that you're seeing here are the number of venture capital funds that are focused in healthcare, or sorry, not the number, the amount of capital raised by venture capitalists that focus in healthcare from their limited partners, right? The institutional investors, your pension funds, your insurance companies, right? Individual investors, family offices, et cetera. In 2025, only $7 billion was raised. At the peak in 2021, it was over $40 billion raised for money that could then go into young startup companies in the healthcare space. For those of you that are investors in these kinds of funds, there's a few logos up here of who was some of the more active investors in 2025. They're folks that we work with, right? We work with a number of different investors across the ecosystem. But this is a little concerning, right? But these things kind of go in ebbs and flows, right? Macroeconomic cycle, so not terribly so, but definitely something to keep an eye on. Importantly, it's not because healthcare is underperforming. This slide here just shows over a few different vintage years, the years that those funds were raised, how healthcare VC stacks up in terms of returns to just general venture capital industries, right? Those that are supporting software companies in your next Uber and Facebook and what have you. See, I'm dating myself. It's probably Instagram or TikTok or something, not Facebook. But on average, healthcare is actually doing just as well, if not better, in those returns. So that's not the reason. Interestingly, because of all that capital that was raised during that peak in 2021, many of those venture funds are still very actively investing in companies. This one I know is a little bit of an eye chart, especially for those of you in the back of the room. If you just kind of look at the top level information here, it's that the blue bars, which are biotech, the other sort of orange and pink bars are like health tech and diagnostics and some other subsectors within healthcare. The bars across 2025, broken down by quarter, are just as high, if not higher, than in 2023 and 2024. So we're still seeing lots of capital go into those early stage companies that need it so that they can run those early trials, they can prove out their technology, make sure that it's working the way they expect. But there's a couple hidden trends that in the depths of these reports you're starting to, that you can start to pick out. One is that all sectors are being increasingly shaped by what we call these mega rounds. So not the young startup that needs a few $1 million to do that next critical experiment to see if their therapy has the ability to make it into a clinical trial, but the $100 million or more fundraise that is backed by some of the largest institutional investors around experienced management teams, lower risk programs, right? Things that are likely going to succeed, but may not be as transformational, right? They're a little more evolution than revolution, right, in our space. And certainly from my perspective, we want to be backing the things that are going to have the biggest ultimate impact on patients, not another drug that's going to just eke out a little bit of market share away from another big player. So this is a little bit of a concerning trend. Interestingly, if we think about first financing, so the first time a company gets institutional investments, oncology remains one of the top indications. Platforms are sort of broad technologies, right, that could have applications in many indications. Then you see a few other on here. So just to take this number and break it down just for a second, in 2025, it was $1.1 billion of first-time financings for companies in the oncology space. 3 deals, 3 companies were half of that, $500 million by 3 companies. Now, not to knock them, they're doing incredible things, but that's a lot of consolidation of capital And there's a lot of great ideas that can come from a lot of different places. So these are some of the trends that we are a little concerned about. It's seeing the sort of consolidation and constriction of capital around things that may be a little bit less risky, that are backing folks that have already had the experience and leaving some of the next generation of entrepreneurs sort of high and dry. Active investors, again, some great folks that we work with. I figured, again, throwing up this bit of a logo soup here, just in case there are names that you all recognize, both in the biopharma space and health tech, devices, diagnostics, and tools. I do want to shout out to a few groups here that were called out in one of the reports, those investors that are supporting the smaller financings. And it was nice to see our logo up on in one of these reports too. Circle it in blue for you. Right, so in the biopharma space and in the diagnostic space, there are some groups that have really kind of focused in on these earlier stage companies that don't need the $100 million round off the bat, but really do need that next few $1 million to prove that their technology has the chance to move to that next incredibly important value inflection milestone. The other thing that's been a challenge as we think about this whole ecosystem is how it trickles down from the ultimate end, right? So as investors, we're looking to make financial return, as well as for us, of course, the impact that these technologies will also ultimately have on patients is incredibly important. So we have to look at exits, right? What is happening when a company goes public? Right, they go from a private company to a publicly listed company on the New York Stock Exchange or the NASDAQ, or get acquired, right, from a big strategic player, a large pharma company, for example. Again, apologies for what is relatively small graphs on these slides, but in the different realms here, I'll just kind of focus on the green in the top left corner. The horizontal bars is sort of reverse chronological order, so the top is 2025, and the vertical bars is chronological order left to right. So exits by IPO and by M&A are a little depressed right now. We're not seeing as many. Big pharma is sort of waiting longer before they acquire companies. Public investors want more data before they're willing to put money into these early stage companies, so that time is just elongating, right? And that back to that opening slide of this taking now from 10 years to 20 years and much more capital to move these therapeutics forward. This is a big part of it. And then the valuation has also come down, right? So pharma is a little tighter with their purse strings and really trying to make sure that they're not overspending on this innovation, even though we know these can be blockbuster drugs that will yield incredible revenues down the road for them. The other colors here are other sectors within healthcare, again, diagnostics, tools, health tech. You're seeing the same thing sort of across the entire industry. So, okay, that was generally, but again, as someone who loves data, I couldn't help but do my own research here. So I dug into one of our favorite databases called PitchBook. It's a database that really tracks private financings, maybe not the ones that you see on Shark Tank, but certainly the ones in our industry, and pulled out specifically the oncology vertical. So companies that are specifically moving their products forward for an oncology use case. Went over the last few years, going back to 2019 when BrightEdge got started, and looked at the number of companies that are being funded through different stages of that early stage progression. So in dark blue on the bottom are companies that are backed by angel investors or maybe going through a small accelerator program, right? So that smaller amounts of capital. In brighter blue is seed funding. So again, that's sort of next stage. In red is early venture capital rounds, more like your Series A, when a company is starting to get a little bit more momentum and traction, and maybe some institutional investors are now coming to bear on this company. And then in gray, the late stage VCs, your Series Bs, your Series Cs, crossover rounds, when companies are really, really well established. I hope what you can see on this slide is that those bright blue and red parts of the graph have constricted over the last few years. In fact, off its peak in 2021, in oncology, seed and early stage venture capital financings are about half of what they were. So 50% fewer companies are actually reaching that stage of getting what I would say is their first institutional investments that really gives them the runway to prove out their technology. Now, this is really concerning from the seat that I sit in. But at ACS, we have something we can do about it. So within BrightEdge, we have been really thinking about how can we intentionally support the most important areas in oncology research and back the companies that are going to bring the potentially highest level of impact to patients. So this is how we've sort of solved this. We have a suite of programs that we have now sort of spun up to enable a full continuum of support. Bill talked a little bit about, in his talk, about our accelerator grants. We are so pleased to work with Bill and his team to support research grants that are really focused on those incredibly important steps within the laboratory, within the academic medical centers, to see if these technologies could be the basis for a new therapeutic, a new diagnostic, some other product. We have also been really purposeful about leveraging that alumni network of grantees across the ACS. I did not talk about AI yet, so I guess I'll throw my little AI plug in here now. We are using a set of new tools to kind of map the research that we've supported, some of the things that are happening in the external environment as well, and look for rising stars in our ecosystem and kind of look for new trends in cancer research that maybe we can spot faster than some of our peers because of that robust and incredibly healthy database that we have of all the research that ACS has funded. One of the sweet spots or the shining stars in our portfolio is our BrightEdge Entrepreneurs program. We spun up this program a few years ago, and it is really enabling, in many cases, first-time entrepreneurs, scientists that want to take their technology out of the lab, try their hand in a startup company, and take that entrepreneurial leap. We know that there are incredible experiences to draw from. Not everyone needs to kind of write that book the first time with a set of blank pages. And as a volunteer-heavy organization, we were able to recruit over 100 incredible mentors and advisors, folks that have been there, done that, brought drugs to market, worked in big pharma, worked in small companies, have had incredible experiences to help support those companies. So we have a program that provides educational seminars on a monthly basis that brings one-on-one mentorship and additional advisory support and a lot of scaffolding to these young entrepreneurs that are trying their hand at this at the first time. Importantly, there's also a check that comes along with it. So we do financially support them as well with a small investment through that program. And then the core of BrightEdge's activity is through our impact investing. So we manage the ACS Impact Venture Fund. I'll talk about that here for a minute. It's about an $85-ish million vehicle. We have the allocation of ACS's investment pool, or the venture allocation of ACS's investment pool that we manage, as well as raising philanthropic dollars to continue to bolster that pool of capital. The returns are all reinvested into the fund so that we can grow the scale of what we're doing and continue to support new companies as ones recycle through our portfolio. Since 2019, we've made 21 investments out of this vehicle. We've had 8 exits, which has been fabulous, particularly given some of the data that we just kind of walked through. And it really importantly, we have taken a really intentional approach to thinking about not only the financial opportunities of these companies, but the patient impact. So through some work of our director of impact, we have built our own proprietary cancer impact investment framework. We take the mission of American Cancer Society, we have boiled that down to about 10 thematic areas that we really focus on. And using an industry set of guidelines called the Impact Frontiers, we measure and manage that impact on an ongoing basis. So when we're making our initial investment decision, and then on an annual basis, we review our entire portfolio to make an assessment of the potential impact that those technologies and companies will have on patients. And that really keeps us true to form and make sure that we're leading with that intentionality, focusing on the areas that are going to have the greatest impact for patients. Now, at the end of the day, right, the amount of capital that these companies require we don't have that ourselves, so we do need to work with your traditional financially focused venture investors. So we work with all of the blue chip investors that I showed in some of the other slides, because at the end of the day, if that product is not successful, if that company isn't able to move it forward, they don't have the additional resources, that impact will never bear out, right? So you have to kind of do well to do good here in this ecosystem, and that's kind of the sweet spot that we try to focus on. Just as a quick look, we have focused across what we call the cancer care continuum. You'll see some of these bubbles in prevention and wellness and care delivery. Don't have many portfolio companies right now that are mapped to them. The industries, some of these areas get a lot more activity than others. About half of what we invest in is in therapeutics. We do a lot in early detection and diagnosis. We do some other areas in survivorship, as well as treatment planning, et cetera. Going back to that BrightEdge Entrepreneurs program for a second, because this is a stat that we're really proud of. For that first cohort, the first cohort that we ran through this program was in 2024. We ran 9 companies through the program. We were the first $100,000 check into most of those companies. There was a couple that raised a few $100,000 before we got involved. Since then, that was our first cohort and the one that we actually have some data on, those companies have gone on to collectively raise over $55 million of follow-on financing. We've participated in some ourselves, but most of that has been external validation of the companies and the technologies that we have supported move through these programs, and is a real testament to the quality of the education and the mentorship and guidance that they've received to really accelerate their trajectories. This is like 20x more successful at raising follow-on capital than sort of the industry average. And for female entrepreneurs, first-time women founders in our ecosystem who are very much underrepresented in biotech and healthcare, that's 45x more likely to have raised follow-on funding if they've gone through sort of our program. So some things we're super proud of. It sort of shows the need to continue to put more capital to work here, and we're actively looking to build that. So as I mentioned, out of the main portfolio, 21 investments, now through the innovation portfolio, many, many more, smaller investment sizes and magnitude, but incredibly important and meaningful, and really proud of the companies that we have gotten the opportunity to support in this way. In fact, we just announced our 2026 cohort just last week. So really excited for our next 11 companies to go through this program. We're sure they're going to do great things as well. So how do we think about BrightEdge in this ecosystem? We built this slide a couple years ago. I couldn't think it'd be more appropriate than for this audience. Sort of at one peak, right, is that vast array of dollars available for cancer research. And on the other side is that sort of late stage investment, those dollars that, again, the more traditional investors are all sort of supporting and backing and moving forward. In the middle, in the traditional sort of biotech world, we talk a lot about the valley of death. It's that funding gap that happens when a researcher has a great idea and has a hard time moving it out of the research institution and into a company. Well, we like to kind of reframe that here at BrightEdge, and we're calling it the impact impasse. Because it's really more important than just a funding gap, right? It is thinking about what companies deserve that funding, right? How they think about product development, how they think about the ultimate patients that their products can serve. And BrightEdge is really trying to play that gondola role of shepherding companies, from one stage, to the next. So this is how we're showing up. This is how we're supporting the investment decisions that we make, and in many ways, trying to show the way for others and work with the big institutional investors and show them why we're backing something that they might consider too risky, right? And support in those conversations. And it's been really quite an amazing run for the last 7 years, and many, many more to go. To just quickly round off, I'm going to bring us back home to kind of what Kelly talked about at the beginning. So much of what I talked about and even Bill talked about was on that sort of first 2 bubbles on this slide, right? The ideas and the testing and the trials and the research side of it. But then after a product is kind of through all of that, it needs approval, and it ultimately needs to reach patients. So if we go back to sort of how ACS is showing up in this ecosystem, I would be remiss if I didn't again highlight some of the work that we're doing across the organization and leveraging both our 501c3 sort of nonprofit tools as well as our 501c4, our advocacy tools, to make sure that these innovations can actually get to the patients that need the most. So we've talked a lot about cancer funding. Our Cancer Action Network colleagues have done an amazing job advocating at all levels of government to make sure that the NIH and NCI budgets are healthy. Some of the research that we've done is that just a 10% cut to that budget could have enormous ripple effects for future drug development. But then affordability and financial toxicity is a big problem that we focus on. So we've made some investments in companies that are helping navigate patients to financial assistance programs and the support that they need to make sure that they can find find additional ways to support and pay for the care. But again, our Cancer Action Network colleagues are advocating staunchly to make sure that affordable healthcare is available to all Americans. May that be through expansion of Medicaid programs, and just making sure that things like pre-existing conditions continue to be covered. The cost of treatments and screening are also covered. And then just quickly on the last two here, clinical trials end up being a standard of care for a lot of late-stage cancer patients, right? Access to those clinical trials is very important, unfortunately still for too many, but fewer than 7% of cancer patients actually participate in cancer trials because of some of the barriers and structural barriers to doing that. So again, we've invested in a company that helps match patients specifically from rural communities, et cetera, into clinical trials, but then also making sure that those are available to everyone. And then finally, Kelly mentioned this, but our rides and lodging programs across the country, again, make sure that cancer patients can reach the treatments that they so desperately need. So I will wrap there. I got the time check signal, but right on time. So as you can see, we are all in against cancer. You all showed up tonight. I think that means that you are too. Kelly said you are now all part of the team. So welcome to Team ACS, and thank you for caring about cancer research, caring about this, and again, thank you for your time and attention. We really do appreciate it.
All right.
I should stop.
That was perfect. Here, have a seat, get your water,
all right.
Get comfortable. So first off, that's a lot of information. I've worked here almost 7 years. I'm still learning. So if you feel like you're drinking through a fire hose, you're not alone. It's totally okay. We have a few planned questions here that I'm going to facilitate before we turn it over to James for the regular question and answer session. And this first one, Dr. Dahut, I'm going to ask you to answer first. So I think it's fair to say that in the news this last year, there's been a lot of talk about threats to cancer research funding and it potentially declining in the federal budget. And then last month, we got some incredible news that because of the work of our advocates and others, there were no cuts to, cancer funding in the federal budget, which is amazing. But my question is, how did this period of uncertainty impact kind of the research landscape in the US?
I think it was devastating. I think on a practical level, people may not realize that if you run a research laboratory at a university, as the scientist, you need to generate essentially all of that money. All of that money needs to come from grants or philanthropy or maybe a little from the university for your own salary, for all the research and all your trainees. And so immediately, when there were concerns about funding, laboratories got smaller. Graduate programs didn't take graduate students. Less postdoctoral fellows who do a lot of the work were not recruited into positions. So, and then it had a psychological effect because I think when you see devastated early stage investigators who are then talking to college students and beyond, then people are going to be discouraged to make these advances we can. Now, we're incredibly excited that the budget was passed and that there's a slight increase in the budget for cancer research. But the reality is the costs for doing research have gone up so extraordinarily over time that even a flat budget, essentially, or a small increase, really winds up being almost a cut. And the other thing that's a little wonky, but you should know because you're smart people, a bunch of wonks here, I'm sure, is that there was a change done. So traditionally, the way grants are funded is that they would impact the budget over multiple years. So if you had a $10 million grant, which would be a big grant, and it was, say, $2 million a year for 5 years, it would hit the budget at $2 million, the federal budget, $2 million each year. So what was done for a large number of grants is that they gave all the money in the first year. And so what that meant is that all $10 million would then come out of the budget in the first year. So that meant the same number of dollars would go out, but they funded significantly fewer grants. Now, over time, the things would come together, right? But initially, what we call the pay line, the percentage of grants that were funded, which are already really low, maybe 1 out of 10, went down to about 4 out of 10. And in certain areas, much lower. And our advocacy work, that's where we worked hard with the Congress and the Senate, and they fixed so they can't go to a number higher than they did in the past, but it's still a lot higher than it did in the past. So it's great news about the budget, but we know there are still many fewer grants that were going out in the past with the same budget dollar, and then science costs a lot more to do. Basically, the baseline grants, the big grant the government uses called R01 grants, which are the core, really haven't changed significantly in dollar amounts, even though we know everything costs more these days. So we're not out of the woods yet. I mean, and I'm concerned that all this progress we're making is going to be stalled. A lot of good research going on in China and around the world, and I think it's really important we continue to do our own great work here.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Steve, anything to add?
Yeah, no, I think, Bill, you hit sort of the nail on the head. I think, that uncertainty is definitely one thing that investors hate. It's really hard to make long-term investment decisions when there is incredible amounts of uncertainty. And although the research funding doesn't hit sort of that end of the spectrum in quite the same way, it is a pipeline problem, right? So fewer investigators going into scientific research career paths, means fewer folks that could be generating those next discoveries for the next therapeutics, could be the next set of entrepreneurs, spinning their research out of the lab. So that's definitely something we're, also just very much keeping an eye on, is how that period of uncertainty has, impacted what could be the future pipeline, because we don't want to be sitting, 10 years from now looking upstream and asking where'd all the water go.
And then review committees get much more conservative when there's a smaller amount of dollars. Mm-hmm. And they're not willing to take a chance on a crazy idea, because if it doesn't work, that means they've wasted their money. And so what happens is you see much more in the way of incremental science approved, as opposed to really the transformational work that needs to be done.
Yeah, overall, right, that level of uncertainty tends to kind of lead to a risk adversity, right? So then you kind of back the things that are less transformational, right? More likely to work, which could mean, less research funding going to those that are the big pie in the sky idea that could, really change the face of medicine.
Things that are a little bit crazy, but
yeah, hey, crazy can be good if it works.
Right.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you. So, Steve, Dr. Kerr, switching over to BrightEdge.
Steve is fine.
So, well, you talked a lot about, kind of the VC space and how that's being impacted right now. Mm-hmm. Can you just highlight for us, how is BrightEdge different from traditional venture capital investors? Like, what is its, unique value proposition?
Maybe you should just start and give your lecture all over again.
Yeah.
I'll give a little anecdote here, actually. We held a summit in Boston a couple of years ago where I had a panel that I had the pleasure of moderating with a number of prominent biotech venture capitalists in Boston. And I was very provocative to this group, and I said, look, you all talk about, right, wanting to invest in medicine for patients, right? And everyone is trying to get a medicine to patients, right? Ultimately, those approvals is what everyone is trying to hang their hat on and say that they're able to do, right? But we show up as impact investors in a very different way, right? Leading with that patient centricity. And I was like, when push comes to shove, do you make the decision that's best for patients, or do you make the decision that's best for your bottom line? And they did not like that question, right? I mean, and I was somewhat provocative on it purposely, and ultimately, you hope that the sweet spot is when those two things align, right? Because the next transformational medicine is going to make lots of money for the investors and the pharma companies and those that have taken it forward, right? In cancer treatment, people thought that immunotherapy for a long time was crazy, and Merck has a multi-billion-dollar product in Keytruda, which modulates the immune system to make it attack cancer, right? So, and that has done absolutely transformative things for how we think about, the patient or patient care for cancer. So, to kind of take that step back, and I kind of, did backtrack a little bit on that question, not to piss off my colleagues. It is very important, right? And we all are trying to do things for all the right reasons. I just have the privilege of sitting in a seat where that patient impact is always our North Star. Again, if the products are not ultimately successful and the companies are not ultimately successful, they won't have impact, right? If no one funds it and it never reaches a clinical trial and it doesn't get approved, then it's not gonna do anyone any good. So you kind of need all of those things to come together, but we do have the privilege of really leading with that patient voice and really making sure that all of our investment decisions are ultimately guided by what's best for patients.
Awesome. And then this is my last question, so it's coming to y'all next, so everyone be thinking, get ready. But Dr. Dahut, to you first. I think we talked a lot about the need for collaboration in the cancer space. And one piece we didn't talk as much about is collaboration between the institutions performing research and donors. So how would you advise donors to, if they're making gift, to make sure they're getting the impact they want to see from it?
Get involved. We scientists love talking about their science for hours and hours and hours. But if you're passionate about a particular nonprofit or cancer diagnosis, and to work with that nonprofit to get to meet the people who your dollars are funding. I mean, it's really, I think, inspirational to see, young adults, young scientists, sort of the joy and passion they have about their work. And, so one thing we do is we have a limited number of our folks who are allowed to sort of listen into our peer review process. And certainly folks that are, really have funded a grant, we really try to connect them with the scientists doing the work. I mean, I think it's really important to see what you're doing and who's doing it and to ask questions. And then also, it's just good to hear what's on your mind. What are the areas that we should be funding more of that we're not? Is it, rare cancer, certain cancers, survivorship, and you bring your experience. Sadly, everybody is touched by cancer, and so whether it's yourself or a family member or a friend, and we really need to change that. And so, we want to work with you.
Awesome, thank you so much. So James, I think we're
All right,
8 minutes early. I'd like to point out.
Incredible! It's never happened. Going early to Q&A has never happened.
I have 25 more slides that I can.
Okay, well.
From our online audience, how will AI potentially lower the number of years to reach the patient and get them access to treatment? So lower than the 17 years, how soon might that be?
I think what AI can do is use large data to enable to determine which patients should get which drug when. There's so much data out in medical records. If there's a way we could actually put it together, we would have a much better way to be able to tell which patients should get which drugs. And I mentioned a little bit earlier on, AI should be able to find targets much faster and work through the development faster. So just obviously AI has clearly answered everything, right?
Yeah.
But
I'll add just a little bit to that because I talked about the clinical trial, sort of part of that ecosystem. That is one of the biggest drivers of both cost and timeline, is sort of the size of the clinical trials and the length of those clinical trials to prove out the efficacy of a new treatment compared to what is the current standard of care, right? The hope is the larger that delta, the more impact that new therapeutic has, the smaller that trial needs to be, and the shorter it needs to be to prove it out, right? It's statistics, right? If the difference between the new therapeutic and the old is small, you need a bigger sample set and you need to try it out longer to see if that's actually a meaningful difference. So the more impactful that potential medicine is, the more transformative it could be for patients, you can reduce that. That typically means, though, a smaller patient population, right? A more targeted patient population, those that are more apt to benefit from that indication, from that new therapeutic, that new target. So I think, to just piggyback off of Bill's point, we're seeing some incredible advances in AI and sort of helping to identify patients that are eligible for clinical trials, to match, match patients in really important ways, and to identify those targets that might look like they don't have a lot of relevance, but for a targeted patient population, it might be a smaller patient population, they can be incredibly meaningful new therapies. So I think that's a few ways that we're seeing play out too in the venture ecosystem. Mm-hmm.
Hello. My name is Bill Prather, and I'm a retired physician and entrepreneur. I guess I have a comment and then a specific question.
Yeah.
Steve, if I can call you Steve.
Absolutely.
You can call me Bill. I have a comment about, I worked with several venture capital firms over the years, having started 3 companies. Venture capitalists are not really that much of a villain, in my opinion. I think that making a decision on whether it's based on patient advocacy, patient effect versus the bottom line, it's pretty much the same 99% of the time. You're not going to invest as a venture capitalist in something without good data.
Yep.
The second is a question, specific question, and it has to relate to what your organizations are doing, whoever wants to answer this, regarding the issue of nanoplastics.
I'll respond to the comment really fast because I completely agree, right? Most of the time, those do align very well. And we work very closely with all of the big venture capital firms, and those are many of my both personal friends and professional colleagues. So I did not mean to insinuate that, right, venture capital is the sort of old adage of vulture capital and there's sort of bad actors. There's always a couple, right, in any industry. But I think, one place where we do see a lot of consolidation of thought is around targets. Right, so you'll see some of the big venture firms, concurrently spinning up 5 companies at the same time, each getting $100 million of financing around basically the same scientific concept. Now, some of that's important, right, because you don't know which horse you're supposed to pick in the race, right, until they kind of run a little bit further downfield. So sometimes that competition is absolutely necessary, but what it can do is sort of leave some gaps in that ecosystem, right? That new target that is less validated is maybe a little less attractive, right, for some folks. So it certainly takes a balance, and I think it takes all kind of, views on that ecosystem, but 100%, right? When that sweet spot lines up, and if you're really impacting patients, the bottom line will come, right? And that's definitely incredibly important. From my vantage point, we actually haven't spent a ton of time on microplastics and nanoplastics personally. So Bill, I don't know if we've done much on the research side there.
We and everyone else, as I mentioned earlier on, talking about, changes in cancer patterns, are spending time looking at exposures for patients across the population. So not only look at microplastics are a little hard to capture that information, but looking at sort of zip code, environment, tobacco, cannabis, everything else, to begin finding populations whose cancer risk is different than others. And then I think we and others are a strong suspicion that you can't exclude the impact of microplastics when you talk about the effect on sort of the inflammatory aspect of that. So we are certainly willing to, and are probably likely funding grants to study that, but using our large cohorts, I think, will be ways to get information along the ways. And then, we will certainly then be willing to speak out as information evolves. So I think it's a really important question, and we should be doing more.
From online, how are other countries doing at raising funds for cancer research and startups, and how are they raising funds?
Research?
It varies from country to country. A lot of countries, China and everything is government down, very government directed, and that's where the research is all significant dollars from the government going down. If you're in England, it's really all driven by a charity called Cancer Research UK, very little government funding, and most of their funds are actually raised through stores and secondhand stores. So, traditionally, we were the engine that funded research throughout the world in a lot of ways. People from around the world came here. And so research funding is significantly less around the world, I think with the exception right now what's going on in China and some of the other countries in Asia. So.
Yeah, I think it's sort of a mirror on the venture side,
Yeah.
right? The US continues to be the largest source of venture capital dollars going into healthcare startups. Europe is also incredibly active, always has been. And interestingly, some of those trends that I had mentioned around these mega deals is almost exclusively a US-centric thing. Not to say that it hasn't happened, but there are more funds that focus on smaller sized raises in Europe. I think the big change in my ecosystem over the last 10 years has been the incredible pace of innovation coming out of China. And that is something that, again, through a very concerted effort of government funding has really accelerated the pace of new technology development. And many of the big venture capital firms all have a core focus on new innovation coming out of China, where they haven't really had that, 5 or so years ago. So it's really incredible to see, some of those evolutions of where the next great innovation is coming from. And from our perspective, we've invested globally. We certainly are obviously focused here in the U.S. because that's where our stronghold of network and everything is focused. But we've invested in companies from Korea, from Israel, from Europe as well. We haven't made an investment in a company out of China yet, but certainly looking at some now.
Hi, my question is for Bill. I've got a couple questions regarding colorectal cancer.
Okay.
You mentioned that you're noticing that not only is the prevalence increasing dramatically, people under age 50, but how's that going to correlate to people over 50 eventually? And then my other question regarding that is that you also mentioned that it's being noticed more proximally than distally, or more distally than proximally. Why is that important? And as you alluded to the fact that alcohol was the first thing that you mentioned, and then you mentioned perhaps food and microplastics. What research is being done there? I know it's a big question, but I was wondering if you can simplify that for us.
Sure. We'll start with the easy question first. So we are seeing a change in colorectal cancer risk as populations age. So for the first time in recent history, the population actually between 50 and 65 have had an increase in their colorectal cancer cases. They've been going down for years, so a little blip up. And so we anticipate when those folks move into the next age group, over 65, we may see an increase in that population too. Now we do know people who have undergone, colonoscopy is actually as cancer prevention as well as cancer detection. And so we do know there's a lot more screening going on in people, over the age of 55, over the age of 65. So those rates are still lower than those rates that are in younger adults. So I think that's, we are likely to see, though, increasing rates over time as populations age. The second question is, why is it important, anatomically, where the cancer is? One thing is the way people present with their symptoms is a little bit different. You're more likely to see blood presentations if things are near the rectum. Sometimes if you have a cancer further up, you might just see a darkening of the stool, so there is a difference. The surgery is different, and the side effects are different from the surgery and radiation, so I think that's important for patients too. And then I think it just shows that it's not something that's happening throughout the colon at the same time. So I talked about that a little bit. If it was, obesity is a risk factor, but if obesity rates were driving it only, one would anticipate you would see it in one area more than the other. So what I'm thinking about, and this is just a theory, that something is going on that's changing the mucosa, the lining of the rectum and the distal colon, that's making it more hospitable to cancer cells. And when that happens, when you get sort of, toxins and stuff that accumulate, that's where things will sit for longer periods of time, then that makes those cells more likely to take hold and more likely then to drive the cancer. The microplastics, microbiome changes all sort of change inflammatory markers. And so that's one of those things we think it may be one of the reasons why we're seeing more cancers. But it's really it's happening not only in the US, this is something that's in many other countries around the world are seeing a similar change in colorectal cancer. I don't know if I got all the questions, but if not, you can ask me later. So,
summarizing a little bit of the online chat going on here, there's a celebration and talking about the importance with funding, sharing the good news with specifically targeted precision medicine. Somebody's sharing a story of their stage 4 cancer recurrence being killed in less than 30 days with targeted precision medicine being matched to mutations. Could you talk about both the celebration and the good news coming up with targeted precision medicine, and also the logistics as far as access and economics matching precision medicine and individual therapies?
Precision medicine in some cancers has been a game changer. Again, we have some oncologists, physicians out here. I mean, lung cancer, for example, lung cancer, and it's still, as I mentioned, the leading cause of cancer death. There are now subtypes of lung cancer where folks can live with for years with taking a pill and live a normal life. But in order to make those diagnoses, somebody actually needs to look at the cancer specimen. And that required actually work from our advocacy arm in order to ensure, and it's the law in Colorado, that folks are required to reimburse for biomarker testing for folks to look for a cancer diagnosis if there is a targeted therapy. So that needs push from the government sometimes to ensure that it happens, and also incentivizes the folks who develop the drugs to find drugs for relatively smaller populations, as opposed to all of lung cancer. If it's 5% of lung cancer, and that makes sense to develop a drug. Now, overall, we haven't found it for every cancer, not for every patient. It's been more complicated than we thought for a lot of cancers. So using things such as the immune system, which sometimes teaches the body to actually fight a cancer itself by sort of unleashing it, is something that works together. So we're not there yet, but thinking how this was done 30 years ago, we've made incredible progress. So.
Yeah. I'll add one example here too. Bill mentioned our Medal of Honor awardee this year, Tyler Jacks. He's done some incredible fundamental work on a protein called KRAS, which is mutated in a large swath of numbers of different types of cancer. KRAS was always considered one of the undruggable targets. We knew what happened to it. We knew the genetic mutation. It's just a really hard protein to create a small molecule drug around. Well, it is not undruggable any longer. Right? Advances in chemistry, understanding of the crystal structures of proteins, a lot of AI work into modeling, right, what those chemical changes or those chemical entities are that could find the mutant-specific forms of KRAS and inhibit its function in cancers, have led to now a number of incredibly promising new therapeutics targeting KRAS in cancer that have the potential to not be a lung cancer specific or a colorectal cancer specific treatment, but a pan-cancer treatment for those patients that have a KRAS mutation. This has been a really incredibly exciting new area, and it's kind of where a number of those sort of new advancements in the research and drug development all sort of came together. So some really, really great stories there.
Hi, my name's Graham Bush, and first of all, I just really appreciate you guys coming and talking about this. As you said, it was a little bit like drinking from a fire hose, really fascinating. But my question is, you obviously have to make decisions about who you're going to back in research, what companies you're going to back, what entrepreneurs you're going to back. And my question really goes to how do you make those decisions based on the impact it's going to have? I think I saw in one of the slides there was a number. It would have to affect over 13 million people. I don't know if that's a hard and fast rule or how you even apply it at all the various stages where you have to make these decisions. And also something you just said strikes me as would have to go into this equation too, which is that you may have a particular cancer that doesn't affect that many people, but the process that they're working on could have applications for a lot of other cancers, and that's got to be really hard to figure that out. So I guess what I'd really like to hear is just you talk a little bit about how you make those decisions and what happens to the cancers or the drug treatments that treat cancers that you don't back because you don't think it has enough of an impact.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I'll clarify the 13 million number that I think you were seeing on one of the slides. Through our impact investing framework, that's the number that we believe the number of patients that could be impacted by the collective technologies across our portfolio. So it's not a threshold that we're sort of looking at, but our portfolio in totality has the potential to impact that many lives if their products are ultimately successful and kind of get into the market in the way that we believe that they could. Bill, do you want to keep going on those companies? Do you want to start on the research side? Because you had a really robust process within your team.
So the way we do it, and we sort of look at our overall research portfolio budget, the vast majority of our dollars, over 100 million every year, goes to what we call investigator-directed, initiated studies. So it's a broad call for people to go ahead and put in research grants for scientific ideas that they think will be impactful. And then those ideas go through a peer review process, it's called. And so they're reviewed first by 3 scientists to look at the merit of the science, and we put a lot of time and effort looking at impact and innovation. And those that sort of make that first cut then go to sort of an in-person or a virtual meeting where scientists then discuss those grants together and then score them. And again, we have a very strong weight on innovation and impact. And then the ones that score the best then go to a smaller committee that we decide, we sort of base it generally on the peer review score, but then we look at areas of potential impact and then potential areas of need. And then we also have areas of topics that are of interest to us. Areas, we talked a little bit about prostate, ovarian cancer. We think there's ability really to make a broad impact. So then we talk about what we call RFAs, requests for applications. So folks then really apply with those topics in mind that we think are potentially areas that we think we can really move the needle the most. So one thing that we're particularly proud of is that we give very good feedback to everybody who puts a grant into us, and we hope we continue as the grant numbers go up. So our scientific directors really work with the scientists, even those who are not funded, so that the next application process, they have a much better chance of being funded by us or by the federal government. And I think that's why those who we have funded, who have done so well, feel such loyalty to us, because we knew we actually listened to them and said, you know, this is what they didn't like about your grant. If you do some work here, you have a much better chance. And so we're really willing to take a chance in a way that maybe the government or the DOD, it's harder, because you know, we really see these are the ideas that will make the difference. But we do, a lot of times, we let people put their best ideas together, and then we pull out the ones that people are most excited about, and then a certain percent will go through topics we think are most interesting, important.
Yeah, so our process for our typical investments is a combination of both reactive and proactive. It's kind of like the way I think about it. We see hundreds of deals a year that kind of come to us from all various, sources and locations, other co-investors, through conferences that we attend, folks that just kind of find our website and ask if we're willing to fund what they're researching. Speaking to Bill's point here, that loyalty that the ACS sort of granting ecosystem has kind of garnered across the cancer research community is a real privilege that we get to leverage. When we find a KOL and a key opinion leader in a certain space to help us evaluate an opportunity, like particularly if they've been funded by ACS or they all know ACS, they're almost always willing to pick up the phone, right, and answer my call or my team's call and have a 20-minute, half-hour, 45-minute long conversation about their view on these technologies that we're reviewing. The number of times that my PhD has become directly relevant in a deal I'm reviewing, I could probably count on one hand, right? But it's the ability to kind of, find the experts in the ecosystem and really converse with them about the opportunities. We also have a scientific advisory council that we leverage that's specifically focused on BrightEdge. Bill Koch chairs that. And those conversations we hold on a kind of quarterly basis to think about where to use a hockey analogy, skate where the puck is moving, right? What are some of the emerging trends in cancer research where we can go really proactively out and say, this is an area we want to plant our flag in the ground and go find a good deal, find the researchers that are trying to build a company, find the co-investors that are interested in this space. An area right now that we're very actively looking at, for example, is cancer vaccines, therapeutic cancer vaccines, again, supercharging your own body's immune system to attack the cancer. So that's a couple of the ways that we work. Another interesting, going back to that theme of collaboration and working together in an area like brain cancer, which has been historically underfunded a lot of different ways because of just how hard it is to develop drugs in that space, some of the rarity of some of those cancers. We actually have a standing monthly, I'll call it a consortium, where we meet with about 12 other brain cancer specific nonprofits and share ideas. So we are talking about some emerging research that either we funded, they funded on the granting side, deals, new companies that they see or we see in that space, and kind of bring some of that collective wisdom to bear. And in fact, a great story that kind of came out of our portfolio in the glioblastoma space was a Yale investigator who spun a company out of his lab, got some of the initial funding from a local family office, the Connecticut Innovations Fund, which is specific to the state of Connecticut, but then us and 3 other nonprofits, those 3 focused specifically on brain cancer, all participated in their seed round to move this company forward, overcome some initial hurdles that they were having in their research. We kind of combined efforts to think about what were going to be the most important experiments for that company to run, for it to get sort of outside interest. And long story short, that was our 7th exit, a company that was acquired ultimately by Merck. And the champion on the Merck side also happened to be an ACS grantee by coincidence. Right. There's lots of them out there, so it's not that hard to find them.
70% of the cancer center directors, and once you have an ACS grant, your chance of getting federal funding is about 70%, which pay lines are 4 to 8%, so it's really a validation of the work. So
yeah, and that investigator at Yale credits sort of the work that us and the other nonprofits did in moving that company forward for really getting it to the finish. Well, still got a long way to go to the finish line. Merck is now taking over running the clinical trials and figuring out all of that space. But Merck came in pretty early on that one, and we were really proud of that outcome.
Thanks, folks. A couple of questions. Going back to the microplastics, it seems like they're so ubiquitous. Traditionally, we're talking about very long-term, very high population studies that may or may not come with definitive answers. Does some of the new science possibly, at least theoretically, squeeze that down? Or
I think it's so ubiquitous, like you say. It's when you brush your teeth, when you floss. I mean, it's this is going to take. And people have been exposed to this for years and years and years, right? So, and you're right, waiting 30 years for one of our cohort studies to say, yes, it's a problem, is not the way to do it. So I do think we need to...
We're the first generation to grow up with microplastics. We just didn't know it.
Right, made our hair fall out.
Yeah. Right. And the second question I wanted to ask, you showed a slide, a bar graph of the falling cancer research dollars that actually started 5 years ago or so. More precipitously, it appeared in 2025 than previously.
it's going to take a little bit of time to get some of that data. Clearly, there was graduate programs that shut down for the time being, but sadly, this stuff is probably going to lag behind as this stuff does. But yeah, I mean, I think, we will begin to start capturing, working with colleagues probably at the NIH and elsewhere to sort of get a sense of what's going on. But it's important for sure.
On the early stage company side, I don't have any good data that I'm thinking of now that would suggest that, say, companies are moving out of the US, right, or getting their starts elsewhere, right, that would be the result of of those figures. I think, certainly I showed the slide and, pulled out specifically the oncology-focused companies, because that's where I spend my time. I think it's relatively true across all indications right now, and it's mostly been, I think, that uncertainty, right? Knowing that these early stage companies are 10, 15, 20-year, in some cases, right, endeavors, maybe to ultimately get approval, obviously, from an investor lens. We're hoping that the financial flows come earlier than that. But I think some of that uncertainty has just taken some of the generalist investors out of the equation, and that, in some of those peaks in 2020 and 2021 that we were seeing, investors across the ecosystem that would invest in all areas spent a lot more time in healthcare than they had traditionally, right? The regulatory environment and some of the nuances has kept healthcare as mostly sort of a specialized industry in the investor landscape. And then the generalist investors tend to get in late when things are really de-risked and you're no longer underwriting the scientific risk, but you're underwriting the business risk, the commercial risk and things like that. When the industry was sort of at its peak, right, and there were more generalists coming earlier stage, we're still seeing a little bit of course correction that sort of happened because of that. So I think, I'm hopeful that this is, yes, there was a little bit of a precipitous drop off in the last few years, but I'm hoping we're in more of a blip because of some of that uncertainty and sort of overcorrection from the 2020, 2021 era still. But we'll see. It's certainly an important area to keep an eye on.
Going back to the online audience, is asking a follow-up question about the scientific advances and access, and they want to know about liquid biopsy, blood tests, removing the need for a physical sample.
So we and others believe that the technology for liquid biopsies for screening, I'll mention first, are needed. And, we talked a lot about cancer early detection and screening, and if we just had screening for every single part of the body, all we would do every day would just be getting screened. And so the technology to have a blood test to screen for cancer, we think, is incredibly important. And, the recent data that came out from the UK, the top level, they had hoped to decrease the number of stage 3 and 4 cancers on their test for 2 years. Did not meet the top level, so that was disappointing. There's some facts about it that we think are promising. Decrease in stage 4 cancers, more early stage cancers, and less cancers diagnosed in the ER. We'll wait to see the data. But blood tests are really needed for every step and for cancer patients too. Having to do a biopsy every time to find out whether there's a change in the marker and the biomarkers are incredibly important. And so we're very supportive for research, for cancer detection and for cancer recurrence, and really to monitor things too. So yes, we should do that.
In that question, you also mentioned something about access.
Yeah.
We're invested in a company that has a liquid biopsy test for both ovarian cancer, where there is no approved screening paradigm,
right,
and for lung cancer. And for lung cancer, those patients that are at high risk, right, where the recommendation would be a regular low-dose CT scan. Bill, you can quote the actual age and cadence of that better than I can. But we know the adherence rate to that is like less than 10%, right? So you're told by your physician you're at high risk for lung cancer. Less than 1 out of 10 people actually show up to get that CT scan to see if they might have a lung cancer. That's incredible, right? And there's a lot of structural barriers as to why, right? You have to check with your insurance company, where is there an imaging center that actually is covered, or you have to get to that imaging center, you gotta take the day off of work, potentially, right? All of those things, find childcare, et cetera. Right, to be able to just go down from your PCP's office to the lab and get a blood draw, right? That reduces that barrier significantly. So those are, again, the science is rapidly emerging. We're super excited about, again, another place where AI is playing a really pivotal role in improving the accuracy of these tests. So there's been incredible advancements. We're seeing some really great, new companies and established companies in this space really, moving the science forward. But that other sort of added benefit of reducing some access barriers is also something we're particularly excited about.
Yeah.
Thank you all for being here. I think we all appreciate all of your comments. 2 quick questions. Number 1, you just mentioned briefly about ovarian cancer, and PSAs have been around forever for all of you gentlemen. And what is the interest in further research for detecting ovarian cancer? And my second quick question is, you mentioned AI for helping diagnose colonoscopy pathologies. How available are they if we just go to our normal gastroenterologist and have our...
Yeah, they probably won't be there. They're out there, but probably most practices don't have it. We could certainly give you the name of the product and you can check, but it's probably, most people aren't going to have that. Ovarian cancer screening is really important. There was a trial done in England about 30 years ago trying to look at CA-125, which is a blood test, as a way to screen for ovarian cancer. The trial was not particularly well done because they focused, the first round found a lot of people who had ovarian cancer at that point. And obviously a screening test that's going to find it when you first look are largely people that already had advanced cancer. And so we do think it's going to be really important to find, new tests for ovarian cancer or fallopian tube cancer, you want to call it. So one thing, like Steve mentioned, we're actually invested in a company that's actually looking at that because I think it is really important. And we do need to get these, the AI show and tell stuff out where it's for everybody and not just, something you see on a slide here in this beautiful location. So both important. Yeah.
Okay, we've got just a couple of minutes left, and I want to give you a chance to give us some closing thoughts. You've had a chance to get to know our community and our audience a little bit, so you can take this wherever you feel it's appropriate. But I want to ask a question about hope and optimism and excitement.
Yeah.
What can we be looking for? What can we be thinking about? What can we do in our daily lives moving forward that can bring us a sense of hope and can support others in this journey?
Well, I'm sitting here, so I get to go first. I'll use the full 2 minutes. No, but it's I'm an oncologist, and I think as an oncologist, you have to be an optimist. And just to see the advances we've made and are continuing to make, I said earlier on, I think we're really getting to the last mile. We're making incredible progress across the continuum. Ways to diagnose cancer earlier, and when you find it earlier, find it easier to treat. And then in cancers, finding really therapies that hopefully will be less toxic you can take for longer periods of time. I do want to mention something else. We think nearly half of cancer deaths are preventable by modifiable behaviors. So if you exercise, you eat well, you don't smoke, you keep a normal BMI, you have moderate to no alcohol is best for cancer prevention, but moderate is certainly better. And then if you're of the age where there's a cancer vaccine for HPV, those things along will decrease your cancer deaths by about 50%. So, like I said, it's the things your mom told you to do, she was right. So I think that's important. So, and exercise of those is probably one of those things that is least appreciated, but easiest to quantify. So moderate exercise is really important. So you're in a nice place. Get outside. So, right? See.
Yeah, I keep telling my kids that instead of those video
They're
games.
in Boston, right?
Yeah, they're in Boston. We're still buried under snow there too. the pace of biomedical innovation has never been faster right now. I think you mentioned that maybe not everyone is sitting around reading academic journals. I love reading academic journals. It's absolutely incredible, and in some ways, like just mind-boggling what we've been able to do over the last 10 years in science. Everything from now genetic engineering and CRISPR therapies and other things that haven't yet had a direct role in oncology, but they're certainly getting there too. The things that I talked about with these sort of elongated timelines and the cost of drug development is also because the bar just keeps getting higher, right? The standard of care is actually really good, right? To Bill's point, in a lot of situations, right? So to make that incremental change, you have to run a larger study and have a longer timeline. So just seeing the pace of innovation, seeing the new types of technologies that are being brought to bear to treat cancer, there's never been a time where we've had as many tools in the toolbox. So I think that sort of exponential growth of opportunity is continuing to bear fruit, and it's just a really exciting time to be able to support those scientists taking their magic potions and turning them into healthy medicines.
Into magic mushrooms. No, that's something else, right?
Yeah.
That's something else.
Well, and I think I'll add, I'm in the people business, and so what gives me hope is the people I meet every day that are so dedicated to creating a world free without cancer. So they're getting personally involved with their time and their wealth. They're getting their companies involved. They're getting their friends involved. And cancer is one of those things, no one person's going to beat it. It's going to take all of us together. And so, I already told you you're on the team, but things like this, people like you showing up, that's what gives me hope. And so I just want to point to this QR code. If you want one of us to contact you to talk about, how to get involved, give you more information, anything, if you fill this out, we will reach out to you. So you just scan it with your camera, a little link will pop up, and then that would be a great way.
Look out for a flood of questions. Please join me in extending our gratitude to Kelly Moran, Steve Curtis, and Bill Dahut of the American Cancer Society.